Welcome back to the Hive Doctor, your beekeeping mentor. Today I am finishing up my sourwood harvest for the year. It's my last flow and I'm really happy with what I've got. I've only got one more box here to extract, but before I spin the honey out of those frames, I wanted to show you how to know when honey is ready to harvest. When is it ready and ideal to take away from the bees? So we're going to talk about that today, as well as the other factors, the environmental factors and hive conditions that contribute to having your frames filled out during a flow. So stick around. Welcome back, beekeepers. So today we're going to be talking about when to know if your honey is ready for harvest. And if you're anything like me, you've seen in the books and you've heard from other beekeepers, probably in person or on YouTube somewhere else, that you want that 70-30 ratio or 80-20 ratio on a frame of mostly capped honey to a little bit of uncapped honey, because you want the moisture content to be low in honey. Honey is nice and it lasts longer when the moisture content is low. Now, what's low? Most of us don't really have a refractometer to measure that. If you do, that's great, but honey moisture should be ideally somewhere between 18 and 15%. It can vary, but that's the range of moisture content that is ideal, and it's what the industry looks for in honey when it comes to how much moisture is still left in it. So when honeybees bring nectar back to the colony, it's high moisture. It's very thin, very watery, and when they store it, a lot of the workers will fan and create circulation through the hive to evaporate as much moisture out of that nectar as they possibly can. And by the time the cells are full, the moisture content is lower, and once they deem it ripe enough, they will cap it off with beeswax. And that's why we, as beekeepers, have to come along and uncap the honey before we can spin it out. It's like taking the lid off of a jar before you can get the pickles inside, or whatever you like to eat out of a jar. So before we start looking at some frames here, I want to talk about the when. When do we harvest honey? I hear a lot of hobby beekeepers talk about pulling a few frames here and there throughout the flow. I learned in the commercial industry that's not the way they do it. I'm not saying the hobbyists are doing it wrong, but there is a less intrusive and an easier way if you just trust the bees and let them do what they do. And that method involves putting on boxes honey supers at the beginning of a flow or right before, and just leaving them alone until after the flow. Once the flow is over, the honeybees will finish off ripening that honey. I give them about a week or 10 days, depending on my schedule at the time. And that's my rule of thumb. At that point, I take the honey, whether it's capped or not, and I mix it all, I blend it all into a 55-gallon drum so that moisture content is going to mix and average out. I don't know what it is because I don't use a refractometer. In fact, the only time I've ever seen a refractometer necessary was when I was in the commercial beekeeping in Florida. We would sell our honey to a honey bottler who would then distribute it to the grocery stores. And they would use a refractometer to see if our honey, what they were buying, what they were getting, was within the 18 to 15% range that we just talked about earlier. If it was too high, which I never saw that happen, they could refuse to buy it. So the lower, the better for everyone. And in that case, a higher dollar amount as well. It might add on a few pennies, but just as kind of an extra note, when it comes to selling to bottlers, they're really looking for color. Orange blossom should be a certain color. And what that means is it's mostly orange blossom honey, or it's mostly wildflower, or it's mostly sourwood. Whatever the honey variety, whatever it's labeled as, it means that that is the plant source that makes up the majority of that variety. There's always going to be other little plant sources. We can't control every little drop of nectar that goes into a colony and ultimately our jars, but that's how that works. So allowing the bees to just do their thing during a nectar flow and then you come along afterwards, giving them time to ripen it up, that should be an adequate amount of time and timing for you to be able to pull ripe honey all at once instead of piecing it throughout the flow. So let's go ahead and get into this box. We're going to look at the frames. I haven't even looked through the frames on this box yet, so kind of hoping it'll be a surprise to me as well as to you, so you can kind of see the thoughts that go through my mind as I see the frames. So let's take a look. All right, so here we go. Now, the outside frames are generally going to have less honey on them than the middle frames because the bees always work the middle and then go out. They'll work the inside of a frame, then the outside, the inside of the next one, then the outside, and so on. So here's what we've got. We've got our first outside frame. They've drawn out a little bit of comb right here, but they didn't really put anything in it. This side, we've only got honey where it's capped. There's a little bit of nectar right here. And so this is going to be lower moisture content because it's capped, it's ripe, than the moisture content of this open nectar. To me, that's not enough to worry about. It's not enough to fret or lose any sleep over. So on to the next frame, I'm going to anticipate more honey and more caps, all right? So there, we're looking at, I don't know, 80-20, 80% of this being caps, 20% not. We've got a little bee there with her head in the cell, tanking up. And then the other side of the frame is pretty much the same. We've got some corners that haven't been drawn out. That'll probably happen next year on the next flow. And then the next frame, a little bit more capped, both sides. And the closer we get to the middle, the more capped it's going to be. This one's the heaviest frame so far. And you see it's pretty much capped to the edges. Even the corners are filled out pretty nice. I measured one of these frames, the weight of it, full of honey. It was a pretty fat frame too. And then I measured an empty frame with comb to see how much weight one of these could hold. And it was about 5 pounds of honey. So if you do a 10 frame box, you can just do the math. 5 frames, that's 50 pounds of honey. But most of the time it's not going to be that much because that frame was drawn out extra fat. As you can see, the bottom of this one kind of bulges out. So I'm going to say on average, a good full box of honey is probably going to be about 4 pounds of honey per frame, not including the weight of the frame. So 40 pounds in a medium 6 5/8 honey super. And then we've got this one in the middle. Kind of surprised to see that's not completely drawn out. And then all of this that has been drawn out and not capped is just about full of nectar. So it's still going to be a lower moisture content, but again, not enough to concern me. I put this all together and blend it and get an average. And let's pull out this frame right here because it looks like it's pretty good. That one's capped to the edges. It's not a fat frame. It's filled pretty much to the width of this bottom bar. And that's about what you're going to see most of the time. If you run 9 frames in a box, you're going to have some nice fat frames of honey. All right, so let's talk about what conditions play a role in what these frames are going to look like. So the factors that influence how much honey you're going to get in a box, some of those are going to be obvious and some maybe not so much. But A, the condition and health of the hive. The bigger the population, the healthier the colony, because generally a weakened colony due to whether it's some kind of disease or mite infestation, the population just is not going to be where it needs to be in order to collect a nice box of honey like this. Weak hives don't make a crop. They may make some honey, but it's generally just enough for themselves and it's not something that I can pull for myself. Honeybees make excess of honey compared to any other thing out there that gathers nectar, and that's why as beekeepers we can come along and sustainably harvest that honey, making sure our bees still have enough, of course. So when you have that first factor involved, a nice healthy hive with a large population, the second influence is going to be environmental circumstances. In other words, weather and the strength of the flow and the timing of the flow. How long does it last? I have read some flows last only 2 weeks. Some can last as long as 6 weeks. But generally 4 weeks is the average that I've experienced in my time as a beekeeper. In Florida, that was with orange blossom in the spring, palmetto in the summertime. We had a fall crop, but it wasn't anything to brag about. Here in North Georgia, I've got my wildflower in the spring, which is usually our larger crop, but it wasn't necessarily so this year. And then we have my sourwood in the summertime. That was a larger crop than my wildflower. In fact, after I harvest this box, I'm going to have somewhere a little over 800 pounds of sourwood honey. I'm really happy about that. I'm excited, and I'm very grateful for what my bees have done for me this year. And I hope that your bees have done well for you also. So what happens if you've got a nice sized colony, they're healthy, their mite level is at a manageable level, they've got no disease, they just don't make the honey? Well, it may not be your bees. It could be that that year was a weak flow. In nature, trees go through a cycle just like the seasons do. I have seen years where sourwood trees, for example, have a very poor bloom. You can hardly see any trees with any bloom on them. It's there, but it's not as strong as other years in a different part of the cycle where the blooms are just busting everywhere. This year was one of those years. And that's the time that you get the most excited. You've got a bumper crop and you can't believe how well your bees did. And with these factors involved, the health of our colonies and environmental circumstances, we only have control over one, the health of our colonies, by using a consistent and effective pest and disease management system. But we have no control over the weather, over the flow, the cycle of the seasons and what they offer. All we can do is get our bees as healthy as they can before flow hits and hope that that's enough. So you know what I would love to know from you guys in the comments below on this particular video, because I've been talking about sourwood honey. I would like to know what varieties you make in your area. I'm pretty sure every area has its own version of a wildflower, but is there anything unique to your area? Put them in the comments below so that I can see them and that everyone else watching this video can see them as well. One of my favorite things about beekeeping is that there are so many different varieties of honey. That makes it exciting because everything tastes so different. I love buckwheat honey. I've tried palmetto. Gallberry is an amazing honey. It tastes, in my opinion, more like blueberries. Blueberry honey doesn't even taste like blueberries. So yeah, anyways, let me know what you have in your area. I appreciate that you guys have watched to the end. Drop me one of these, tell your friends about the Hive Doctor, and I'll see you in the next video.